Hello, this is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to the Sunday Forum for this Sunday, February the 8th. We're going to lock in on the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the reason we're doing that is because we've had two texts 2 weeks in a row, last week and then this week, all coming from Matthew chapter 5 through 7. That's where we find the Sermon on the Mount. Last week, we took a look at the Beatitudes, and now we're going to move farther in to this wonderful sermon. And so I thought this would be a great time to review the whole Sermon on the Mount, its power and its standing among Christians. Jesus' longest and most famous sermon. And so we're going to turn to the Bible Project first in two parts. The first part, we'll take a look at the Beatitudes. So watch the film and enjoy.
2,000 years ago, on the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea, a teacher named Jesus of Nazareth went up onto a hillside and addressed a large crowd.
It was a crowd of nobodies. Poor and sick people, their land occupied by the Roman Empire, who charged heavy taxes. This is a ragtag group.
And while they don't look like much, Jesus claimed that something surprising was starting with them.
So he opened his mouth and said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of the skies." The kingdom of the skies? What does that mean?
Well, Jesus uses this phrase to talk about a new kind of reality. From our perspective, we see a world of violence and corruption where might makes right. But for Jesus, there is a realm where generosity reigns, where there's justice and peace. It's a world where love is the final word.
And that reality might as well be up in the skies. It's beyond us.
Exactly. It's God's heavenly reality, which might seem far off. But Jesus was claiming that heaven was coming to earth, right here and now, beginning with these people.
That's unexpected.
And so is what he says next.
Blessed are those who grieve, for they will be comforted.
So this group that's at the bottom of society, they know all about loss and grief. But Jesus said something's coming that's going to turn sorrow into joy.
And then he said, "Blessed are the unimportant, for they will inherit the land."
And these people are not powerful or important, but just wait, Jesus says, because one day it will be you all who are ruling the world.
You know, it kind of sounds like Jesus is trying to start a revolution.
Well, kind of, but it's not a revolution for those who are hungry for power or influence. This is a movement of people who are going to serve because they long for healthy relationships between people and communities and nations.
Yeah, as Jesus puts it next. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy.
Just imagine it, a group of powerless nobodies ruling the world through generosity and forgiveness and justice. This is a Jesus-style revolution.
The next thing Jesus says is, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." And this one really raises the bar. To be part of this revolution, my heart needs to be so pure I could look directly at God.
Well, Jesus knows that all of our choices, even our good ones, are often driven by mixed motives. For Jesus, real peace is only possible through people who know that they need to be transformed if they're going to truly love God and others.
And this sounds wonderful, but it's a radical calling.
That's exactly right. In fact, Jesus goes on to explore just how radical it is.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God.
So God's new reality won't just happen by itself. It requires people who are willing to enter into the conflicts of others, urging and helping create a way towards peace.
But that way of life can be dangerous. And so Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of the skies."
Yeah, entering into conflicts and advocating for peace, that's not a comfortable way to live. And so Jesus calls people to this peacemaking revolution, and he names the high cost.
Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in the skies is great, for they persecuted the prophets who were before you in the same way. What does that mean, the prophets before you?
Well, Jesus and this whole crowd are Israelites. And in their Hebrew scriptures, God promised that it would be through Israel that his kingdom would be restored over all the world.
But as the story goes, Israel becomes as corrupt and violent as everyone else, and they end up enslaved to oppressive nations.
But Israel's prophets stood up to these kingdoms and criticized their corruption. They said that one day God's heavenly kingdom would break in, starting with a small group of Israelites who would be willing to surrender everything over to God.
So Jesus wants this crowd to see that they're part of that legacy.
Yes, and that's why Jesus concludes this first block of teaching with 3 images from their scriptures.
The first is, you are the salt of the land.
Salt is a mineral that preserves food for a long time. And in the Bible, salt is used as a symbol of God's long-lasting covenant with Israel. Jesus is saying that he and this ragtag group are the launch party of God's long-lasting ancient promises to renew the world.
And then Jesus says, you are the light of the world, and a city on a hill cannot be hidden.
He's referring to the biblical image of God's light, his presence shining out from its dwelling place in the temple in Jerusalem, which was a city on a hill.
But these people, they aren't the rulers. I mean, they don't even live in Jerusalem.
And yet, surprise, Jesus says, you all are God's salt and city and light. You all are the blessed ones, the new Jerusalem that's going to display God's kingdom to all the world.
Wasn't that great? And now we want to push further into this Sermon on the Mount with a part 2, again from the Bible Project, where we go deeper into this wonderful and the most famous sermon of Jesus. Enjoy.
The Gospel of Matthew is one of the earliest accounts of Jesus of Nazareth.
And in chapters 5 through 7, we find a collection of Jesus' most well-known teachings, often called the Sermon on the Mount. Here we learn what Jesus means when he announces that the kingdom of the skies has come near, and what it looks like to participate in God's kingdom. The whole sermon has been given a 3-part shape. There's the introduction, then the large main body, and then the conclusion. The introduction announces the surprising, counterintuitive identity of those who are part of God's kingdom. Then comes the main body of teaching where Jesus explores what he means when he calls his followers to be righteous.
What does he mean by righteousness?
Righteousness is about living in right relationship with God and with others. It's a character trait that creates justice and peace in the world. And the body of the sermon is like Jesus' manifesto on righteousness, examined from 3 angles and 3 big parts. How this righteousness relates to the Torah, how this righteousness relates to religious practices of his day, and how this righteousness is expressed in our relationships with God and with neighbor. Finally, Jesus concludes the sermon by calling people to make a choice about how they're going to respond.
Okay, I see it. 3 main parts of this whole sermon, and the middle part itself has 3 parts.
Right. And then every one of these parts itself has 3 parts. There is a lot of design in the structure of the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to go over all of it. In the introduction, Jesus offers a surprise announcement to the people standing in front of him. They are invited to experience the good life of God's kingdom. He first offers 9 sayings that redefine who is experiencing the good life, commonly called the Beatitudes. Here, we learn that those entering God's kingdom first are the lowly outsiders who hunger for righteousness and suffer as peacemakers.
Next, Jesus calls his followers salt of the land. What's this all about?
In the Hebrew scriptures, salt is a symbol of God's long-lasting covenant relationship with Israel. So Jesus is claiming that he and his followers are carrying Israel's covenant relationship to its fulfillment.
Next, Jesus calls them the light of the world and a city set up on a mountain.
Jesus is referencing here a promise from the prophet Isaiah that one day the inhabitants of Jerusalem would reflect God's light and peace and blessing out to all the world.
So Jesus is saying that he and his followers are fulfilling that promise.
Right. And how they go about doing that is what the rest of the Sermon on the Mount is all about.
Now, in the main body of the sermon, Jesus calls his followers to do righteousness.
Righteousness means living in right relationship with God and with others. And Jesus explores his vision of righteousness from 3 perspectives, resulting in 3 big parts to the main body of the sermon.
The first perspective is that his teachings about righteousness fulfill the Torah and prophets. What does this mean?
Well, the Torah and prophets refer to the Hebrew scriptures. In this big idea that Jesus fulfills them, it's unpacked in 3 parts. First, Jesus claims that he's not setting aside the laws of the Torah. Rather, he's bringing Israel's story and all of its laws to their completion. Next, Jesus offers 6 case studies of how his righteousness fulfills the Torah. He explores the topics of anger, lust, divorce, telling the truth, revenge, and enemy love. Finally, Jesus sums up this way of life as teleos, a Greek word that means complete or whole. The purpose of the Torah is to teach people God's wisdom so they can become mature, whole people who spread God's blessing to the world. And this call to become whole or complete links back to this section's beginning, where Jesus claims that living by his teachings will fulfill the Torah and the prophets.
Next, Jesus looks at how his righteousness relates to the religious practices of his day. Now, this section has 3 parts.
Right. In the first part, Jesus claims that living in right relationship with God and others results in a reward. But be careful, Jesus says, because if you're doing your righteousness to get public praise, then you'll miss out on the real reward that God has in store.
Next, Jesus gives 3 examples of how religious devotion can go sideways. His examples are generosity to the poor, prayer, and fasting.
In each of these, Jesus challenges his followers to express their devotion to God in subtle ways that don't attract attention. Then he completes this section by teaching about what the real reward is.
Yeah, he says, don't store up for yourself treasure on the land, but store up for yourself treasure in the sky. So what is the sky treasure?
Well, this idea of treasure links back to Jesus' opening claim that true righteousness brings a reward. The greatest treasure is not admiration from people. Rather, the real reward is knowing and being known by the loving God of the universe.
And that leaves this third and final perspective, how doing righteousness affects our relationship with God and neighbor.
Now, this section itself has 3 parts. First, Jesus talks about money and possessions.
Why start with money?
Well, our stuff tends to claim our allegiance and causes us to worry. And so our relationship to our stuff can be one of the biggest obstacles to healthy relationships with God and with other people.
Jesus teaches, don't store up your stuff on the land. Rather, store up treasure in the sky.
Then Jesus gives 2 parables. One is about 2 kinds of eyes you can have, a healthy, generous eye or an evil, stingy eye. The second parable focuses on 2 masters you can serve, God or money. Then Jesus gives a beautiful homily about worry. Why chase after security from things that are ultimately insecure? Jesus invites us to trust the generous God of creation who cares about us more than we can imagine.
That's the first part. Next, Jesus directly addresses our relationship with God and neighbor.
Yeah, this section begins with, do not judge others, or you too will be judged. Then come 2 more parables, another about eyes, how you shouldn't try to remove a speck out of someone else's eye
when you have a log in your own.
Then comes a parable about not tossing holy pearls to pigs and dogs. It's a riddle with multiple meanings, but essentially it's about using discernment when we try to help and correct others. Then, because relationships are so complex, Jesus encourages his disciples to ask God for the wisdom they need. Ask, seek, and knock, and the door will be opened for you.
This section of the Sermon on the Mount ends with the golden rule. Do to others what you want them to do to you.
Jesus says that this simple teaching is what the Torah and prophets are all about. And so the golden rule concludes the third perspective on doing righteousness. And it also links us back to the opening of the main body of the sermon, where Jesus said he came to bring the Torah and prophets to their completion.
Finally, we're going to look at the last major section of the sermon, the conclusion.
Here, Jesus places a choice in front of his listeners about how they're going to live their lives.
Now, this section has 3 parts.
And each one illustrates this choice with a different image. The first image is about 2 paths with 2 different gates. One leads to life and the other to ruin. Second is about discerning between 2 kinds of leaders who claim to represent God. They're like 2 kinds of trees, one good and one bad. Not everyone who says they speak for God really does, but Jesus says you will know a tree by its fruit. The last image is about 2 types of houses you can build. If you ignore Jesus and build your house by your own wisdom, it's like building on sand, and good luck when the storm comes. But if you listen to him and build your house with Jesus' wisdom, you are building your house on a rock. And with that, the Sermon on the Mount comes to a close.
Okay, so let's review the whole sermon. It begins with the surprise announcement about how the good life of God's kingdom has come to the least likely people. And then, in the main body, Jesus teaches how to do right by God and others. And finally, the conclusion calls for a decision. In light of everything Jesus has said, what choice will you make?
That's a great summary. Now it's time to read and then reread and reread again the Sermon on the Mount.
The Sermon on the Mount. It's only 3 chapters. Now you've gotten the summary from the Gospel Project. I want to encourage you to go back and read the whole thing, all 3 chapters, and that will prepare you to hear the sermon on Sunday. Enjoy. Thanks for joining us on the Sunday Forum. Bye-bye now.